Hi, I'm back. And I think we should be able to finish the lecture with this video. So we've talked about correlational research, and another word for correlational research is non-experimental research. And we've established that the main characteristic of non-experimental research is that the variables are not manipulated by the experimenter. The experimenter just looks at how they occur in the natural world. We've also established that correlational research has high external validity. Now, we're going to turn our attention to another type of research that's experimental designs. And experimental designs are trying to find causal relationships. But I want to give you a caution right here. We can't ever, in science, we can't ever be 100% certain that we've established a causal relationship because we're human. We don't know everything about the whole entire world, but we can come pretty close. But I just want to make sure that you know is that when we say causal, we're using it in a loose sense. And these types of relationships have very high internal validity. So we're trying to hold variables that we think might be alternative explanations. We are controlling for them. And in a minute, you'll see what I mean by controlling. We've got a couple different ways we do that. So what is the hallmark of an experimental design? Well, it's the opposite of a correlational design in the sense that the researcher manipulates the independent variables. So the independent variable is manipulated in an experiment and the dependent variable is measured. We already know that from earlier in the lecture. So the dependent variable depends upon the independent variable. So if I'm looking for effect of a different teaching methods on young children's behavior, I might establish a way to expose groups of children, different groups of children, to different teaching methods. So in that case, I would be manipulating the teaching method to which each child was exposed, and then I would measure how much those children learned. And in that case, the learning, what the kids learned, would depend upon the teaching method, or the dependent variable would depend upon the independent variable. If you say it enough times, it'll make sense. And on the next slide, I'm going to give you examples. Let's say we're doing a study to see if smoking causes cancer. And our dependent variable is cancer, which I'm representing by a cigarette. And the independent, I messed it up again. Yeah, the dependent variable is cancer, which I'm not showing. And then the independent variable is the smoking. So I'm manipulating how much cigarette smoke our sample of mice is exposed to. So I'm manipulating how much smoke, and I want to know about incidence of cancer. So in that case, cancer would depend upon the smoke. So a couple more terms you need to know. Treatment is the manipulation. So in this case, the manipulation is cigarette smoke. And then levels of the treatment are the amounts or categories. They're getting no smoke, 1 cigarette worth of smoke a day, 2, 3, or tons and tons of smoke. So those are the levels. The levels are the amounts or categories of the treatment. And the treatment is the manipulation, or in other case, it's our independent variable. It's what the experimenter is changing to see how it affects the dependent variable. So I've said this a bunch of times, and now I'm finally going to define it. Another hallmark of experimental designs is that the experimenter not only controls or manipulates the independent variable, but the experimental also has control over extraneous variables. So if you'll remember, and I think it was this lecture, either this lecture or last lecture, when I gave you the example of the dog Philip, and we wanted to know if his face got cuter when we had food in front of him. And we decided that the person holding the food, the type of food, the background, those all might influence ratings of Philip's cuteness. So in order to control those potential extraneous or confounding variables, we held them constant. We had the same person every time, the same food every time, and the same background every time. That's holding them constant. And at this place, I want to stop and note that two terms that are used interchangeably, confounding and extraneous, are used interchangeably. So extraneous means confounding, confounding means extraneous. And one way that I just described is that if we want to control extraneous or confounding variables, we can just keep them constant. So I think it's really interesting to know that when they do genetic studies on disease, or they do mammal studies of disease, they are so specific about holding variables constant that they make sure that the animals they use are the exact genetic strain as each other. So if there's a difference between the groups, it's not because of genetics. Genetics are held constant. The other way that we can control extraneous variables is we can randomize their effects. So the idea behind that is, if it's not possible, either because of money or time, it's not possible to hold extraneous variables constant, we can try to make sure that they are not systematically in one group or another. So the idea is, in sampling, we don't systematically sample from one population. We look at a lot of different populations in hope that we'll randomize those extraneous variables. So for example, back to the kids in the learning program, ideally we would not take them from a pre-existing classroom, or definitely not from different schools, because if one school was known for having smarter kids, that might be they learned more and not because of the reading program. So we kind of make sure that our sample is varied, and we want to do this randomly, ideally. Or the other thing we do is assignment, and that's how we randomize selection or assignment to groups. So we don't assign people to groups in blocks, we randomize them, and we're going to talk about methods of that in a couple of lectures. So experimental designs hold control over extraneous and confounding variables. And as you might guess, the better this control is, the higher internal validity the study has. Okay, so now you know what experimental designs are. And here's another oldie but a goodie, a study that I love because it uses a really interesting method of gathering information. And we'll talk about that maybe a little bit if we have time. So this study, again, another old one done in 2003, and it was called Demonstrations of Implicit Anti-Fat Bias, the Impact of Providing Causal Information and Evoking Empathy. Whew, that's a mouthful. So here's my little attempt at joke. I don't think anybody, I don't know. You guys can laugh if you do, make me feel better. Nobody ever laughs at the in-person classes either. Okay. So this study was really interesting. The literature review basically said that a lot of the obesity prejudice in this country, and there is obesity prejudice, and the worst thing about it is sometimes people that are obese themselves are prejudiced towards themselves, and this prejudice makes it difficult for them to get healthy. So the researchers were looking at obesity bias, and they were looking at all different types of biases, and they realized that part of it was thinking that people were lazy, that they had a lot of control over their weight. While we don't always have that. If you look around, obesity runs in families. A lot of it's genetically determined. No matter what I do, I will never be 4'2" and weigh 80 pounds. I'm from Eastern European, big people. We eat potatoes and cheese. I will never be that tiny. So a lot of things are genetic. So after looking at all of this research, the experimenters assumed that the biases would be lower when participants are informed that the primary cause of obesity is genetics, and the bias would be higher when participants are informed that the principal cause is overeating and lack of exercise. So the introduction kind of led to biases will be lower when participants think that fat people are lazy, and it'll be higher when, it'll be lower when they think fat people can't help being fat, and it'll be higher when they think that fat people can help being fat. So the idea is that biases will be lower when participants are informed that the primary cause of obesity is genetics, and higher when they're informed that the principal cause is overeating and lack of exercise. So this study was done on a beach in Connecticut, which is very different from a Hawaiian beach. It was like one of the 4 days of summer they have. No, they have more than 4 days. But they collected data from 144 participants. And what they did is they set up a booth at the beach, and they had people come up to the booth, and they were offered either a cold water or a lottery ticket for, I think they gave away a prize at the end, like a cooler or something, for participating. Participants came up in groups of 2 or 3, and they received 2 things. The first thing they received was a little pamphlet, and the pamphlet told the participants, they were told that it's an informational pamphlet, but it really was the treatment. And they received one of 2 or 3 pamphlets, I believe. The first one said obesity is caused by genetics. The second one said that obesity is caused by lack of exercise. So they received that, and then they were told to fill out an IAT, an implicit association test. And these tests are often given online, but this study was done before the researchers could afford tablets or internet at the beach. So the idea is to fill out the test as quickly as possible. And the test looks like that. It's got headers up here, and nouns along the in the middle of the page, and they're longer than that because they give people like 1 minute to fill them out. They have to fill out as many as they can. The basic idea is to take the word in the middle and categorize it quickly as either good or bad. Murder, we know is bad. Hope, we know is good. See, pretty easy, right? But there's a trick to it. And the trick is that participants were also given different questionnaires. And the difference between the tests or questionnaires was how the words were paired in the header up here. So in one of them, fat was paired with bad and thin was paired with good. In another one, it was the opposite. Fat was paired with good and thin was paired with bad. So the idea is, if you have no prejudice against fat, you would take the same amount of time to fill these tests out. But if you have prejudice towards fat, there would be a difference in the time that it takes you to fill out this questionnaire. So here you've got murder, fat bad. Okay, famine, fat bad. Happiness, thin good. You're just going right along. If you think fat is bad and thin is good. If you think fat is bad and thin is good and you're filling out this one, your brain has a little jiggle to get over. Kill. Well, kill is bad, but fat is bad. So, it's that quick. That's why this test is timed. Starving kind of is like fat, but it's also bad. So it takes you a nanosecond longer to fill out this questionnaire if you're prejudiced. So that's how they measure the bias, by how long it takes people to fill out questionnaires. So if you're really bored sometime, look up the implicit association test on the internet. You can just put it into Google. And there are universities around the country and the world that have these experiments set up, and you can take them for fun. You can see if you're prejudiced against women in mathematics, against race. There's all kinds of interesting things that you can come up with. And the implicit association test supposedly is a way to get over that ability of everyone to say, oh, we're not prejudiced. Nobody's prejudiced, because we're all a little bit prejudiced. The key, I think, is being aware of it and doing what you can to learn about it and minimize it. So here's the results. The results were the difference between the two options. So a larger difference indicates that they were more prejudiced. It took them longer. It took them longer to fill out the survey where they thought it didn't match in the header, and a greater degree of prejudice. So a larger difference indicates the greater degree of prejudice. And don't worry, I won't ask you the details of this, but basically you want to know that this longest bar here, I can't get my, try one more time this longest bar here was the eating and exercise prime. So basically people who got the eating and exercise prime, or what I like to call the laziness prime, were more prejudiced than the people who got the genetics prime or the no prime. Now, this kind of sad thing is everybody was a little bit prejudiced. Everybody came into that experiment with a little bit of prejudice, because if there was no prejudice, people that weren't given anything to read would have gotten 0. And even people who had the genetics prime, they were a little bit prejudiced, but not as much. But the ones who got the eating and exercise prime, they were the most prejudiced. So the hypothesis was supported. It predicted that people who got the laziness prime, which is what I call the eating and exercise prime, were the most prejudiced. So, is this a correlational study or an experimental study? Yeah, you're right. It was an experimental study. We're looking for a causal relationship. Why is it an experimental study? Well, we got to step back and identify the variables. So what were the variables in that study? Right. They were cause of being fat, and amount of prejudice. I'm sorry, no, they weren't that. They were prime, what people were told about being fat. That was the condition. What people were told about being fat, and then their prejudice. So the variables were information they were given and prejudice, right? Did the researcher manipulate those variables? Well, the researcher didn't manipulate variables. The people's prejudice, they came up with themselves. But the researcher did manipulate the type of information that they gave the participants in the study. So they either gave the participants no information, that little pamphlet that said the cause of obesity is genetics, or that almost identical little pamphlet that said the cause of obesity is lack of exercise and overeating. So those are the variables. And they did. The researchers did manipulate the information that the participants were given. So we know that's an experiment because the researcher manipulated the variables. It's an experiment. Why is it an experiment? Well, we just said that. The researcher manipulated the variables. Okay, good job. So we have gone So far in this lecture, we've learned about internal and external validity and how important they are to understanding where a study falls in the body of research literature. We have learned that overall correlational research is associated with high external validity, and experimental research is where the researcher manipulates the variables and it's associated with high internal validity. So correlational is high external validity, experimental is high internal validity. So we've just got one more slide to go through. And remember, I said at the beginning that a lot of students get confused. They think that correlational or experimental depends on where it's done. Has no effect. And I want to show you this. Okay, laboratory, where the study is done, are just settings where variables may be controlled. And here's a picture of, at UC Davis, we used to have an infant development lab. So there's a picture of someone in that lab conducting an experiment with an infant. That's in the laboratory. Field settings are natural environments in the jungle or the urban jungle. Those are just where the participants are naturally. So like the beach. The beach was a field setting. So I want you to know that the difference between correlational experiment, you can't look at where it was done because that's not going to tell you. The setting, the research setting does not tell you if it's correlational or experimental. What tells you if it's correlational or experimental is if the researcher manipulated variables. So example, the panda study, it was correlational. We didn't manipulate any variables, but it was done in the lab. It was done in a controlled setting. It was done in a panda research center. That was where the captive pandas lived in the wild. We didn't put them in a special laboratory. Hey. A survey, there's a study called the Hawaii Health Survey where they do random digit dialing and they ask health questions about inhabitants of Hawaii. That's a correlational study because they don't manipulate anything. They just ask them questions, but it's done in the field because the participants are in their own homes. They're just answering questions. Another example of an experimental study done in the lab, and you guys will not know this particular example, but if you've had introductory psychology, you're probably pretty familiar with Milgram's experiment. That's where the experimenters manipulated the ability of participants to give people shocks. And they found out that people, if an authority tells people to do things, they are often ready to do things. So that was an experimental done in the lab because the researchers manipulated the participants. And then very last is an experimental study done in the field. So we know that the obesity study that we just talked about was done in the field. It was done on a beach, and it was experimental because the researcher manipulated the variable. The researcher manipulated the type of information the participants were given. So that's it. Bottom line is you tell the difference between correlational and experimental studies by identifying the variables and then determining whether the researcher manipulated the variables or not. I will see you next week.